Hi guys, Miss Francis here to talk to you about genetic diseases that follow Mendelian patterns of inheritance. So thousands of genetic disorders actually follow Mendel's patterns of inheritance. For example, albinism, which leads to albinos, is a relatively mild genetic disease, but then there's cystic fibrosis, which is a life-threatening disease. But both of these genetic diseases follow Mendel's patterns of inheritance. So let's start investigating some of these diseases. The first disease that we'll investigate is cystic fibrosis. Now, it's possible for a parent to marry another parent without any health problems and have a child that does have these health problems, this genetic disease. Similar to how I could have two parents with brown eyes have a child with blue eyes, it means that both parents were carriers of the recessive allele, where the recessive allele is what leads to that genetic disease. Cystic fibrosis is caused by a defective CFTR gene, where this CFTR gene codes for the membrane protein that transports chloride ions. If this protein channel is not working properly, what ends up happening is a buildup of mucus, where the mucus can form in the digestive tract, in the lungs. So cystic fibrosis is an autosomal recessive disorder. Autosomal just means that it's not carried, it's not sex-linked. So here's what it would look like where I have a defective CFTR channel. So my chloride ions cannot function correctly. My channels can't function correctly, and the chloride ions are not properly transported. So these people might have to go through daily medications. They might be on nebulizers. Unfortunately, it is lethal. Without treatment, affected children die before 5. With treatment, for example, in the United States, people with CF usually live till their 20s or early 30s. Here is the pattern of inheritance showing how two unaffected parents, an unaffected father and an unaffected mother, could potentially create an affected child, because this father and this mother are carriers for the CF genetic disease, or that they have the CF allele. Potentially, these parents could have an unaffected child. They could have unaffected carrier children, or they could have an affected child, meaning that child has cystic fibrosis. Now, it is possible that every single one of their children are affected or unaffected. It is possible that every single one of their children are carriers. Or unfortunately, it is possible that every single one of their children could potentially have cystic fibrosis. This is what a pedigree chart of two carrier parents with cystic fibrosis look like, or I should say two parents with the carrier allele for cystic fibrosis. Tay-Sachs is another example of a genetic disease that follows Mendelian genetics patterns of inheritance. It's a lethal recessive disorder, and it's caused by a dysfunctional enzyme that fails to break down brain lipids. And usually the symptoms begin with seizures, blindness, degeneration of motor and mental performance after a few months of the child being born. Again, here's the pattern of inheritance when I have two unaffected parents that could potentially have an affected child. Now, this doesn't mean that all of their children are going to be affected. It just means that a child could potentially be affected. There's a 1 in 4 chance of each one of their children having Tay-Sachs. So, the physical effects, there are nerve cells that are destroyed in the brain and the spinal cord. Because of that, there's loss of motor control, atrophy of muscles, seizures, where these symptoms start appearing 3 to 6 months after birth, and ultimately and unfortunately, it leads to death. So inevitably, the child dies, unfortunately, after a few years. Sickle cell anemia is caused by the substitution of a single amino acid in hemoglobin. So, for example, the normal protein that would be found in hemoglobin is glutamine. However, due to a mutation, the amino acid that gets coded for instead of glutamine is valine. This single amino acid substitution causes sickle cell anemia. So what are the symptoms of sickle cell anemia? Well, primarily what happens is your red blood cells are deformed. They kind of look like sickles, hence the name sickle cell anemia. And what that causes is a whole cascade of symptoms. The prognosis for people with sickle cell anemia is interesting because it depends on whether you're homozygous normal, heterozygous normal, or homozygous recessive. If you're homozygous normal, it means that if you live in an area where malaria is present, you could potentially die of malaria. If you're homozygous recessive, meaning you are inflicted with sickle cell anemia, you die of that sickle cell anemia. However, if you are a carrier, you are relatively free of both sickle cell anemia and malaria does not affect you. So in order to be a carrier of sickle cell anemia, that would be preferable if you live in an area where malaria is present because you have the sickle cell trait. However, you're usually healthy and this gives you increased resistance to malaria. So we call sickle cell anemia codominant because people have, the heterozygous people have both these alleles. Could you imagine if we could potentially go into a person's DNA and fix their mutation in order to create a normal or a corrected DNA? CRISPR is in the forefront of today's technology, and it makes this possible where we could potentially eliminate sickle cell anemia from a person and give them healthy red blood cells. However, there are many ethical implications that come along with technology like this. Recessive alleles are more likely to be carried if I have a common ancestor. So most societies and cultures have banned or there are taboos between marriages of close relatives. For example, royal families wanted to maintain that royal bloodline, and what they actually ended up doing was perpetuating these recessive alleles that ended up leading to genetic diseases. So why do most societies ban marriages between close relatives? Because of the increased probability that individuals who have a recent common ancestor carry those recessive alleles that could potentially lead to life-threatening disorders. There's more of a chance that these recessive alleles will show up in their offspring. Achondroplasia is a form of dwarfism that's caused by a dominant allele, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, but it's similar to how having 5 fingers is recessive versus having 6 fingers, which is dominant. And what that means is that 99.99 of the population are homozygous recessive for this trait. In this case, this trait that we're talking about is this rare form of dwarfism. So how is this rare form of dwarfism inherited? Well, if I am homozygous for the trait homozygous dominant, I am a dwarf. If I am heterozygous dominant, I am a dwarf. However, if I am recessive, if both of my alleles are recessive, I am not a dwarf. So why is this so rare? Because these allele dominant alleles are much less common than the lethal recessive alleles, because these allele dominant alleles kill the offspring before that offspring has a chance to mature and reproduce. Therefore, that allele, that dominant allele that dominant allele that is lethal, does not get passed on to future generations. So here's a picture of a girl with this rare form of dwarfism. Huntington's disease is another example of an autosomal dominant disorder. It causes death at a relatively advanced age after the individual has already passed on this lethal allele. So that's why Huntington's disease, although similar to achondroplasia, are both dominant autosomal disorders. The frequency of Huntington's is more than the frequency of that rare form of dwarfism. So what happens to someone with Huntington's disease? It's the deterioration of the nervous system. It's irreversible. There's currently no cure, and inevitably the person dies from Huntington's disease. Here's a Punnett square showing how a father who is affected with Huntington's disease that mates with a mother who is not affected by Huntington's disease has a 50% chance of passing on Huntington's to their offspring. So Huntington's disease was mapped to the tip of chromosome 4, where if I look at chromosome 4, the HD gene is located at the tip of that chromosome. Now, if that HD gene is mutated, it means that my glutamine chain has more than 36 repeats. I repeat glutamine, that amino acid, more than 36 times, and as a result, I have Huntington's disease. There are also disorders that follow Mendelian patterns of inheritance, but there are also environmental factors that play a role. We call these multifactorial disorders, where there are many or multi-factors that play a role in the inheritance of that disorder. So for example, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, alcoholism, some mental illnesses like schizophrenia and manic depressive disorder are influenced not only by your genetics, but by environmental factors, such as your diet, such as your exercise routine. Do you exercise? Do you not exercise? So those diseases are affected by environmental factors as well as genetic factors.